Hi everyone. So in this second discussion board, this is a little bit more of a focused analysis. So I personally would recommend to kind of have a small introductory paragraph in this discussion board where you kind of introduce the general story of the story you pick, like the plot, and then kind of end it with a thesis in a way where you're saying oh, well, this is my main point. So what could that thesis entail? Well, if we look at the prompt, it says analyze what the story is specifically saying about the general theme of life and death. So you could say something like author X in his story blank states this, whatever this is, about the theme of life and death. Or author X in his story blank says blank about the theme of life and death. And so that's what's, I think, important to kind of identify up front, this is what they're saying, or he is saying about life and death in this story. From there, what you would do is look at specific examples that help you understand what he is saying about life and death. So let's just take Open Boat, for example. There's a quote on the bottom of page 9. I think that's interesting. And so I'm just going to talk about it. I'm not going to totally analyze it for you because that's what you're going to be doing on the discussion board this week. But I want to kind of highlight it for you, and maybe it's something that you want to bring up in your post. So this is at the bottom of page 9 of our PDF. It says, if I'm going to lose my life to the sea, if I'm going to lose my life to the sea, why was I allowed to come this far and see sand and trees? Was I brought here merely to have my nose dragged away as I was about to taste the holy food of life? So I think that the reason this is an important quote to maybe focus on is that it's something that's kind of repeated either directly or kind of worded differently, but it's an idea that is repeated throughout the story, this idea of almost making it to the end or almost making it to salvation, but then sort of being dragged back or into the clutches of death or the sea, right? And so I think that this might be kind of interesting because there is kind of a nature, the power of nature sort of running through the story, in terms of a secondary theme. And we'll get to that more in the second quote. But I think that might be an interesting thing to help you understand, what is he saying about life and death, and why is this sort of, such a cruel joke in a way. And so since that is kind of, you can see the repetition of it, that might be a quote that you might want to kind of explore and analyze in your post. Now, the second quote I want to look at is actually the last sentence of the story. So in our version, things are kind of translated. So if you read the original version of the story, the prose is a little bit more difficult to kind of understand. Most of the time it is kind of the same. I just read both of them back to back, and so there are kind of big differences. But I wanted to point out the end because I think the way they changed it kind of changes how I perceive the meaning of the story and the ending of the story. So anyway, in our version, the end sentence says, and they felt that they could then understand. And the understanding is the sea's voice, right? And if the sea is representing death, maybe they can understand death. In the original version, though, it says, and they felt that they could then be interpreters. The reason I think that is an interesting change is that if we think the sea is associated with death, perhaps, that in our version of the story, they say they can understand death, which kind of makes sense if you're kind of thinking about the story, They went through this experience and most of them survived, and that they can now understand something about death. In the original version, though, the reason I think interpreter is very similar to understanding but really different, is the idea of what an interpreter does, right? So obviously an interpreter has to understand something. So if you tell me something in language A and I need to translate it into language B, I have to understand language A in order to translate it, right? So not only do they understand what the sea is saying, but then they can interpret it for other people. And so I think that's the real key difference there, is that they have the ability to interpret what the sea is saying rather than just understanding it. Because if I understand something, I might just kind of keep it bottled up, right? I might understand it and it just might be great for me, but if I'm interpreting something, the implication there is I have to tell someone else something, right? Because normally you don't just interpret something if you're not giving it to someone else, right? You don't just interpret something from language A and then into language B and go, wow, I'm so glad I did that. And so the reason I think that that's so important is that not only do they understand something about what the sea is saying, but they also can interpret it to other people. Maybe the people who hear where it says, it seemed that instantly the beach was populated with men and blankets and flasks and women with coffee pots and all the remedies sacred to their minds. So they can interpret what the sea is saying to those people, right? Whereas in our version of the story, they understand it, but they might not be telling it to those people or any people, right, for that matter. And so that's something I really don't care for in terms of the change there, because, like I said, yes, they understand something about what the sea is saying, but I think the line interpreters is totally different in terms of what they might be doing with that understanding. So, something to think about. Maybe you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think it doesn't matter that they made that slight little change there at the end. Who knows? This is something great and fun about literature to talk about in your discussion board. If you do Google and look at the other version of this story, just make sure to tell me where you got it from, because, you know, as you can imagine, there's a bunch of different versions of the story that may or may not be 100% true. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is a side conversation, so for all of you who just wanted to learn about Discussion Board 2, you can click off and go away now if you want to. I just kind of wanted to bring this up because I thought it was interesting. I think in some ways that you can think of this as an allegory, and if you wanted to, I don't think that that's a incorrect way of interpreting the story, but it reminds me so much of a Twilight Zone episode from the 50s called 5 Characters in Search of an Exit. And so I think that's one of the best Twilight Zone episodes, and I won't give away the kind of twist Twilight Zone-y ending, but basically the premise is that there's 5 characters and they all want to get out of this box, right? You can kind of see a parallel here, right? Because in the story we read, we have 4 characters and they all want to get off this boat, right? Now, the reason I think it's interesting and that there are parallels to one another is that in the open boat story, there are specific roles, right? And we know these people and understand these people through their specific roles, like, what their job is. In the Twilight Zone episode, they kind of take it a step further, and you have a clown, you have a ballerina, and so each person has these very, 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 very specific roles, and they look and sometimes act like their specific role. So I thought that was interesting, and I think that maybe they might be saying some similar things about life and death. If you're interested, I linked to the Twilight Zone episode. I was only able to find a clip of it, but if you have Netflix, you can watch this episode for free. So yeah, if you're interested, I kind of put it up there. That's maybe a fun little side conversation that we could have if you'd like to. All right, well, thank you so much. I know that these discussion boards can be kind of difficult sometimes because we're trying to get both of them done on a very strict timeline. So if I could help you out in any way, please reach out to me. Thank you very much. See you. Bye.